It's my pleasure to have James Perloff back on the show. James, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Very good to be back on our interesting times, which always has interesting topics.
Thank you, thank you. Of course, James, you're the author of Shadow of Power, correct?
The Shadows of Power,
Shadows of Power.
Truth is a Lonely Warrior, Tornado in a Junkyard, which is about Darwinism. And I also wrote the script for the movie Shattering, which came out last year, which is a primer on the New World Order, narrated by Kevin Sorbo, and has a lot of people from alternative media within it, people like Joyce Riley and J. Edward Griffin, um, Adam Kokesh, and about a dozen others.
And that's roughly based on the first 7 chapters of Truth is a Lonely Warrior, correct?
You have a great memory.
So if you watch that, that gives you a kind of a taste of what the book is. And so
Hmm.
I read
Yes.
I read that book. It's a great book. It's a great primer on these things for people who are new to it because it's written in a very approachable and pedestrian style. So same as Shadows of Power, by the way. Very
Yeah,
complex topic. So
and that's what people need who are new to this. Otherwise, it's like writing a PhD science book for somebody who's just a novice student. I mean, you do need to have information fed to you in a way that is digestible, and it's also documented so that people see its credibility. And I try to walk people through with some of the more basic stuff first, like false flags, and show that there's a trend of false flags through history. And then we say, well, why is there a trend of false flags leading us into wars that apparently haven't been necessary most of the time? And then we say, well, it's because there's the same controlling force. We just kind of walk through logically like that, and then we show media control, Federal Reserve control, why our economy is the way it is, and so forth.
you connect the dots,
Hmm.
name names,
Hmm.
and once you start to see that how the connections are made, who they are, we start to see that the system or the system of I guess various factions or networks that operate
Hmm.
and how they meet together and control things. So
Yeah, they're integrated with each other, and
yeah.
people just need to see the big picture and step outside that horrible box of mainstream media, from CNN to Fox, that has been leading them not to question everything from vaccines to 9/11, and get out there and really start to see things that make an explanation for geopolitical events that makes sense. And that's really what alternative media has done. We do make mistakes, but we don't deliberately lie. We're not part of Operation Mockingbird, and we don't work for the CIA.
Yeah, and again, a lot of that is because to address these things is to break out of your trance,
Hmm.
get out of your comfort zone, and many
Yeah.
people aren't willing to entertain such things. Although they're willing to watch movies where these things occur, whether
Uh-huh.
whether it's political assassinations or coups or various conspiracy theories that are in movies, they don't think it applies to real life. Um, although though it's plausible for movie script. I don't think it's plausible for reality. But if they do read the true history of these events, to realize it's all too plausible.
Yes,
So
and actually, the explanations we have are far more credible than the contrived. We have to strain to try to explain why Building 7 fell on 9/11 without being hit by an airplane. You really got to push it.
mhm.
Um, and for Obama to try to explain why we're fighting a war against ISIS, whom we previously supported, and why do we support a group and then fight it? Is there something else that's going on besides just fighting terrorism? So we offer the rational, logical explanations, while the politicians and the newscasters, constantly have to strain to try to convince the public of the pretext explanation, which really doesn't make any sense. And our goal is to convince the public, like jury members, to change their view, like the people, the jurors in 12 Angry Men, from accepting the untrue story that the prosecution of the mainstream media has presented, and show them factually from the facts themselves why that story is not true, and let them come to a truthful conclusion.
Mhm. And the first step to that is probably just turning off the television.
Oh, that would be great first. Oh, great first step in anybody's life. Yeah.
So, but reason why I brought you back tonight is well, you wrote a very interesting article regarding the American Revolution, the true nature of the revolution, The American Revolution, The Secrets Buried. Oh, I'm sorry. The American Revolution Part 2. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and was the revolution a Christian war? And this, you put a different interpretation of the American Revolution and the principal figures in that revolution, and perhaps the ideologies or guiding beliefs behind the founding fathers, and it may shed some light on what the United States is and its role in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So let's the American Revolution Part 2. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and was the revolution a Christian war?
Right. And by the way, the first part of this is all about the battle that ignited the revolution, which we really won't be getting into much tonight. I think it's about the Battle of Lexington. I so happens I grew up in Lexington, Massachusetts, so I always had a special interest in that. And having written for a long time in geopolitical affairs, I discovered and then deeply researched the fact that the Battle of Lexington was really a false flag intended to deceive the British into appearing that they fired first and get the revolution going. That's what part one is about. But tonight we'll be talking about part two, which I especially wrote for the 240th recent anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And we're going to be discussing tonight the fact that it was not written by Thomas Jefferson, as commonly believed. But I think, Tim, that I should first put out some disclaimers because this is a sensitive area, the Founding Fathers. You know, I wrote for the New American Magazine, a very patriotic magazine, for almost 3 decades, and many people think that if you say anything critical about the American Revolution or the Founding Fathers, you therefore are really infringing on sacred ground. It's if you've burned the American flag. And so I want to issue some disclaimers up front. Number one, I'm not advocating that we return to Great Britain's rule, colonial rule, or something like that. I've been accused of that, you know. But I'm not British. I have no interest in Britain, and certainly I recognize the evils that have come out of the Bush-Blair Anglo-American establishment alliance that Carol Quigley discussed. I'm not interested in seeing us further our relationship with Britain or something like that. Number two, I should mention that people come up to me, and I actually had somebody come up and say, after they read my article on Lexington, said, "So you're against the Bill of Rights, are you?" And so I'm going to make it clear, I am very much in favor of the Bill of Rights. In fact, I think it's one of the greatest barriers there is to the New World Order. But what I like to point out to people, and this is something that a lot of patriots don't know, is that the basic rights you see in the Bill of Rights already pre-existed the revolution that began with Lexington in 1775. In other words, what I'm saying is people had freedom of speech in this country. You know, there was an ocean between us and the Redcoats, and there was nobody sat in our homes telling us what we could or couldn't say. People said what they wanted. They had freedom of speech. They had freedom of the press. And by the way, freedom of religion, I've seen people say that the American Revolution was fought for freedom of religion, but the truth is King George III wasn't telling anybody what church they had to go to. We had all kinds of denominations here in America before the war began. As far as the right to bear arms goes, that was actually embedded in the Englishman's Bill of Rights of 1689. So that's 100 years before the American Constitution was formally established. They already had the right to bear arms, and they had the right to a trial by jury as well. So that was accepted in the case of customs duty violations, you know, during the colonial pre-war years. But that was because the British knew that if 12 American colonists, a jury of 12 American colonists, tried an American for violating British customs rules, they'd always find the American innocent. So you had to go to an admiralty court for that in that particular case. But for something like robbery or a crime like murder, of course you got a jury trial. So those basic rights were already there. So we do not, in spite of what people think, the war was not fought to establish those rights. Then a couple other things I'll just mention. I am not opposed to a just war. I'm not a peacenik. If there is a just war, yes, it should be fought. But as you know, Timothy, many wars have been fought over false flags and false pretenses, and for the benefit of banksters and not the people at large, despite whatever propaganda has appeared in the news media. And finally, let me just mention that I'm not against rebellion of any kind. There are times to rebel against the government, and the Bible even lays out a justification for that. When men are ordered to do something that is contrary to the will of God, they are justified in rebelling. So I'm not against rebellion of any kind, but again, as we're going to see today, many revolutions are done for ulterior motives often tied to Freemasonry instead of godly motives. So so I've issued those disclaimers, but now we can go ahead with our main topic of who really wrote the Declaration of Independence. Are you with me?
I'm sorry, when you were talking, I had my mute button on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's my that's my,
We can edit that out. I take it.
no, that's
No,
fine. It's
okay.
all very human. That's okay.
I'm
Um,
sorry. I was talking for so long. I probably um, didn't give you enough of a warning that I was about to end off. But
um, but yeah, the of course the account we were given that it was Thomas Jefferson who penned the Declaration of Independence.
correct. It's taken as an article of faith.
In fact, I remember it was in 1976. There was a musical called 1776 that aired on television. I think Ken Howard, he just passed away. The White Shadow played Thomas Jefferson, I believe, if I recall properly, and Ben Franklin or John Adams plays what's his name? The guy who was in St. Elsewhere, The Graduate, the father, the actor,
Oh, I know who you're talking about.
the voice of the
His
voice.
name escapes me, but I know exactly who you're talking about. The obnoxious guy in The Graduate who talked about plastics.
Oh no, he played Ben's father. Ben's
Oh,
father,
okay.
and
All right.
he also was the voice of Kit in Knight Rider. But anyway, he played John Adams, I believe,
Okay.
and in this musical, and this just came to my mind. I remember watching when I was a kid.
Hmm.
It was it was it was kind of a comedy set. But he says, and there's a long scene in it where John Adams convinces Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence John Adams says to Thomas Jefferson, because you are popular and I am not.
Hmm.
And so there we have this portrayal. But in your article, you detail that for several decades after the American Revolution, after the Declaration of Independence, no one really could identify who wrote the Declaration of Independence. Correct?
That's right. It was a state secret, and if you'd asked somebody in the year 1800 who wrote it, they would not have said Thomas Jefferson. That it was not until 1821, which was 45 years after the Declaration, that Jefferson dropped a hint that he'd written it. And he put it actually in a very ambiguous way, or somewhat ambiguous way anyway. He said, he's recalling the committee. There was a drafting committee that included himself, John Adams, Ben Franklin, who of course was Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, and Roger Sherman, whose family says he was a Freemason, and Robert R. Livingston, who was the Grand Master of New York. And what Jefferson wrote was, quote, the committee for drawing the Declaration of Independence desired me to do it. It was accordingly done, and being approved by them, I reported it to the House on Friday the 28th of June, when it was read in order to lie on the table, unquote, and was placed before the president of the Second Continental Congress, John Hancock, who was also a Freemason. Now, I noticed something interesting in my writings on this, Timothy, which is that there seems to have been some kind of 50-year oath of silence associated with the American Revolution. I say that because, number one, everybody who took part in the Boston Tea Party did take a 50-year oath of silence, and that's why no participant in the Boston Tea Party ever wrote anything about it for over 50 years. It was not until 1834 when a guy named George Hughes, who'd been in that action, wrote a book called, or contributed to a book called Retrospect of the Boston Tea Party, 1834. Now, the reason this struck me was I was writing this article on Lexington, and I discovered that the fact that Americans had fired shots at the Battle of Lexington was also kept a secret for 50 years. It was not until 1824, 849 years, that public information was started to give out that Americans had fired shots. Originally, the original accounts in 1775 was that no shots had been fired, even in retaliation at the British. So that had a 50-year mandate of silence on it. And then with the Declaration, you see it takes Jefferson almost 50 years to start dropping hints that he had written the Declaration, and where it is kind of also interesting, and I don't know that this has significance, but it is interesting that if there was a 50-year oath of silence associated with the Declaration, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the third and second presidents respectively, both died exactly on the date that oath would have expired. They both died exactly on the 4th of July, 1826, the 50th anniversary. And by the way, Timothy, I've always romanticized that as I was growing up. I said, wow, those guys just held on till the 50th anniversary. Maybe that is the way it happened, but interesting that all these 50-year periods occur before the truth starts to come out on some of these events associated with the Declaration
Now that oath,
and the Revolution, excuse me.
that oath, is your suspicion that it has something to do with Freemasonry?
Well, one thing I elaborate on in my article on Lexington was the heavy role of Freemasonry, both in that battle and the Revolution. Of course, about half of Washington's generals were Freemasons. Of course, he was a Freemason, and he was sworn in as president by a Freemason, but Robert Livingston, who we already mentioned. But the Battle of Lexington, Paul Revere had ridden out to meet John Hancock at the house, at the what they call the Hancock Clark House in Lexington, which is situated right behind the Lexington Green where the battle took place that started the war. And Paul Revere was sent on that mission by Dr. Joseph Warren. That's what it tells you in your history books. And he sent a second writer named William Dawes. And what the history books don't tell you is that Joseph Warren was the Grand Master of St. Andrew's Lodge, Freemasonic Lodge in Boston, and that Paul Revere, John Hancock, and William Dawes were all members of that lodge. So everybody on the circuit of Paul Revere's ride were Freemasons, members of the same lodge. They never mentioned that part in the history books, And but if you go into my article, The Secret Spirit on at Lexington Green, which you can find on my website, jamesperloff.com, I go into a great detail on the role of Freemasonry and in that, and of course, Freemasonry played a huge role in the French Revolution, which occurred close to simultaneously over on the European continent. And of course, Ben Franklin was the Grand Master not only of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, but the Grand Master of the Nine Sisters Lodge in Paris. There's a great deal of coordination between these two revolutions in terms of Freemasonry. But we'll return to the Declaration.
Yeah. So you have, well, of course, we have the official story, Thomas Jefferson penning it, and I guess in the article you detail just so the writing style itself, but also original drafts had mentions of criticizing or calling for the abolition of slavery. Of course, that's a little inconsistent because Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, so many of the founding fathers. But I think what your suspicion is that it was the author of Common Sense, Thomas Paine, who actually penned the document.
That's exactly correct. And just to make it clear, this is not a novel idea. In 1872, Joel Moody wrote a book was called Thomas Paine, the author of the Letters of Junius and the Declaration of Independence. In my online article on who wrote the Declaration, I also quote an article by Walton Williams, written in 1906, to the effect that it was Thomas Paine. I also cite the book published in 1947, Thomas Paine, author of the Declaration of Independence, written by Joseph Lewis. So this idea has been around for well over a century and a half. That it was Thomas Paine, and we're going to talk about how we know it was Paine and why Paine couldn't be admitted as the author. So you were talking about the slavery aspect. Let's talk about the elements of the Declaration of Independence that show us not Thomas Jefferson, and that's just a great place to begin with. Is the slavery clause. Now, if you look at the original draft, I want to mention that there is a draft of the Declaration in Jefferson's handwriting, but there's also one in John Adams' handwriting. So you could just as well say that proves John Adams wrote it. Actually, these appear to be copies of Paine's original. Let me just back up one step and we'll mention who Thomas Paine was. Thomas Paine was an Englishman. He was a pamphleteer, a very outstanding writer who came in touch with Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin, in the years preceding the Revolution, was not in America. He was in England, and he was a member of the Satanic Hellfire Club, which actually worships Satan. And you can look up the Hellfire Club online and Benjamin Franklin's connection to it. In any event, somehow Paine came in touch with Franklin, who apparently found him to be a great talent, and he was sent to America. He arrived on November the 30th, 1774, Thomas Paine did, with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. So he arrived less than half a year, less than 5 months before the Battle of Lexington that started the war. And he was met by Benjamin Franklin's personal physician. He arrived in Philadelphia and he proceeded to live in Pennsylvania. Again, bear in mind, the Grand Master of Pennsylvania is Benjamin Franklin. Now, in no time at all, he'd written the number one document calling for American independence. That was the pamphlet called Common Sense, which sold tens of thousands of copies. Just overnight literary success for this Englishman in America. Just amazing. Now, I want to point out, I'm a writer, so I just want to mention, Timothy, that it's unusual for a writer to get this kind of instant success. And I think that Freemasonry had something to do with it. I want to give you another example of Freemasonry's role in instant success. When of course, that the French king helped out with the American Revolution, right? Well, the King Louis XVI was reluctant to fund the American Revolution, but he did so because there was this big parade in Paris where the French citizenry came out. And this is all detailed in the book published quite a few years ago called Revolution and Freemasonry by Bernard Fay. Okay. Now, so the king of France was convinced that the people of France wanted him to support the American Revolution. Well, what he didn't know was that this parade was entirely orchestrated by the hundreds of Freemasonic lodges in France. It was under orders, okay? So he got faked out. And he helped pay for the American Revolution. Well, I think that probably had something to do also with Thomas Paine's overnight literary success with Common Sense. But okay, so he's living in Philadelphia when the Declaration of Independence is written, and since he was Benjamin Franklin's choice to write Common Sense, which he wrote anonymously, by the way, would he not also be the logical choice to anonymously write the Declaration of Independence? So let's look at that, the literary proof that he wrote it, or strong evidence that he wrote it. And you mentioned the slavery clause. Okay, the original Declaration includes these words: "He," meaning King George III, "has waged cruel war against human nature, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep an opening market where men should be bought and sold." And he capitalizes the word men. Very significant. Okay. And it goes on. I won't quote the whole thing. But it's, as you said, it's unusual that Thomas Jefferson would write this because Jefferson was a slave owner. He owned more than 600 during his lifetime. And up at this time, he'd never penned one word against slavery. But on the other hand, Thomas Paine, in 1775, had written a passionate pamphlet against slavery called African Slavery in America. And he wrote, quote, for example, "Are traders in men," capitalizing the word men, "an unnatural commodity must know the wickedness of the slave trade if they attend to reasoning or the dictates of their own heart." And it goes on and on. Okay, now, by the way, you and I are both against slavery. No criticism of Thomas Paine for being against it here. But we're making the point is that why would Jefferson, a slave owner who'd never written a word against it, include this passionate anti-slavery clause in the Declaration? But the dead giveaway, Timothy, is the fact that the word "men" is capitalized in both this passage in the Declaration of Independence, which of course was deleted due to objections from slave owners, and it's also the word "men" is also capitalized in Thomas Paine's pamphlet on slavery in 1775. It's a dead giveaway.
So we have style. We also have, and also philosophical, ideological viewpoints that are consistent with Thomas Paine that would be inconsistent with Thomas Jefferson.
That's correct.
And also, I think you mentioned this earlier, is Thomas Jefferson. There was never an outright claim or assertion that he wrote it. He more or less kind of hinted at it, but somehow it became sort of just accepted throughout American history. Jefferson wrote it, but there really is no proof to that.
Again, one of the main proofs would be we have a copy in his handwriting, but again, that we believe was simply copied from Paine's original. Let's look at some of the other evidence now. and I think this is pretty important. The Declaration of Independence really shows a lot of scorn for King George III. I mean, here's what it says about him. He says, in the current Declaration as it's written, it says, quote, "The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people," unquote. Okay, so that's pretty strong language to use against your king. So let's compare Paine and Jefferson on this subject. Okay, Paine, in his pamphlet Common Sense, called him, quote, "the royal brute of Great Britain, the hardened, sullen-tempered Pharaoh of England. I disdain the wretch with the pretended title of father of his people, who can composedly sleep with their blood upon his soul." Okay, so Paine is just tearing into this guy in Common Sense. But let's compare that to the words of Thomas Jefferson in his summary view of the rights of Britain and America. He always referred to King George simply by the title of His Majesty. I'm going to quote Thomas Jefferson now. Quote, "To propose to said Congress that an humble and dutiful address be presented to His Majesty, begging leave before him, as Chief Magistrate of the British Empire, the united complaints of His Majesty's subjects in America, which would persuade His Majesty that we are asking favors and not rights, shall obtain from His Majesty a respectful acceptance, and that His Majesty may think we have reason to expect when he reflects that he is no more than the chief officer of his people," unquote. Very respectful in his tone, not this "you're a wretch and a tyrant." And so when you see that being called unfit to rule the people, tyrant in the Declaration, you can again pick up that this is Thomas Paine, not Thomas Jefferson speaking.
Yes. I think he also, one of the other quotes you have in here, he goes, "The king, the naked and untutored Indian is less savage than the king of Britain."
Right. There's not even as civilized as an Indian, according to Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine.
Here's another one from that is like I think a pretty dead-on clue. The Declaration of Independence uses the word hath, which is an archaic form of the word has. And here's what it says in the Declaration. It says, quote, "All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed," unquote. Okay, so why is that significant? Well, Thomas Jefferson has 3 million words in print, estimated. Not once did he use the word hath, although there were a couple of co-written state documents that did have the word hath in them, but we don't know that Jefferson was the one who actually wrote the word hath there. On the other hand, in Common Sense, Thomas Paine used the word hath 87 times, so that's 87 to nothing. So I would say the chances that he wrote the word hath into the Declaration, not Jefferson, are pretty strong.
It's a pretty strong case in favor of Paine as being the author of the Declaration. The question is, it's such a momentous and important document. Why wouldn't Mr. Paine take credit for it?
Okay. I'll just leave that by saying that there are other things, such as its denunciation of the use of Scotch, mercenaries, which of course made no sense since Thomas Jefferson traced his ancestry to Scotland and had Scott tutors during his education, but Thomas Paine had expressed disdain for Scotsmen when he was in England, and you just go on and on. The use of capitals, the fact that Thomas Jefferson had never written any document calling for independence before, but of course, Common Sense, that was all about independence. But it goes on. Okay, let's talk about why, as you say, why Thomas Paine could not subsequently be admitted to be the author of the Declaration, and when we have really outstanding evidence that he was. And there are 3 reasons that we can point to. The first is the Declaration of Independence was supposed to be written by elected officials, right? It was supposed to be a representative of a representative government. But Thomas Paine was not. He was in Philadelphia, but he was certainly not an elected representative. The second of the 3 reasons is that he was not even an American. Now, this is a debatable point because he had moved to America. He did pledge allegiance to our cause, and in fact, he did take an oath of allegiance or citizenship to Pennsylvania, but it was awfully quick because he didn't come here till November the 30th, 1774. So you could argue he was an American, but he certainly hadn't been an American for long. And it obviously would have shocked American sensibilities if they'd known that the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence had been an American so briefly. And I should add to that, he later returned to Britain before the Constitution even came into effect. He was in Europe from 1787 until 1802. That's 15 years, wasn't even living in America later on. So that would have shocked Americans quite a bit. That's reason number two.
And I guess in his Age of Reason, he takes a very dim view of traditional Christianity, right?
And yes, that is the number one reason. The third, it's third. I'm saving the most important for last. But in 1794, Thomas Paine penned a book called The Age of Reason. Now, if you follow, I'm a church member, okay, and American churches, especially your conservative evangelical churches, are very much in what I call the David Barton School of Theology. And David Barton has written several books which strongly aver that America is a Christian nation and the founding fathers were Christians. I mean, that is almost, he's made his livelihood to a large extent from writing books to that effect. But what we're pointing out here is that Thomas Paine was the author of the Declaration, which started that war. And here's what he wrote in The Age of Reason, which was devoted to discrediting Christianity. He said this, quote, "It is the fable of Jesus Christ as told in the New Testament and the wild and visionary doctrine raised thereon against which I contend. Of all the systems of religion that were ever invented, there is none more derogatory to the Almighty, more unedifying to man, more repugnant to reason, and more contradictory in itself than this thing called Christianity." I'm taking various quotes here, Timothy. Here's another one. Quote, Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason. "I have shown in all the foregoing parts of this work that the Bible and Testament are impositions and forgeries. I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, the Roman Church, the Greek Church, the Turkish Church, by the Protestant Church, or by any church I know of. My own mind is my own church." Unquote. Hardly the words of an evangelical, Bible-believing, banging Christian. Okay, I mean, this guy is 100% anti-Christian. And since America had a large Christian population, it obviously could not be noted that the guy who wrote our founding document was a man of such views. That is one of the three main reasons, but it is the number one reason. And you could never have David Barton writing those books today if this was widely acknowledged.
Yes, I mean it was a big concern for Americans of the day, still is today, but more so back then, when the vast majority of Americans would have described themselves as practicing Christians.
Correct.
Of various denominations. So to have someone like Thomas Paine pen their Declaration of Independence would not have been politically feasible back then.
It's a monkey wrench.
Yeah. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson, the phrase we have, separation church and state, he had to write that. That was a letter he wrote to a Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut, I believe.
That's correct.
Yeah,
very correct. Yes.
Because even he was suspect, because he thought it was a deist, and his faith was. Most people were suspect of his Christian faith, and he just had to write this letter saying, "I believe in the separation of church and state," and somehow that's become the constitutional doctrine. But that's a whole other story. Maybe not. So maybe not. So basically, it had to get the idea of Thomas Jefferson being the author, sort of being the ghostwriter, or not the ghostwriter, but the having it ghostwritten by Thomas Paine and being credited to Thomas Jefferson would have made it more acceptable. Although, again, it wasn't officially acknowledged at the time. Up until the early 19th century, it wasn't generally known that Thomas Jefferson had actually penned the document, or wasn't believed.
Yes, and then it became embedded in our history, and it's accepted, widely accepted. Very few people think otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to elaborate something else. Where I was talking about churches and their view of this document as a Christian document. I was sitting in church one time, and um, during a 4th of July sermon. This is not a church I go to anymore. But the pastor was given quoting the Declaration of Independence in an effort to prove that it was a Christian document and that the founding fathers were Christians. And I'm going to quote the Declaration of Independence as he did. He put emphasis on certain words, okay? These are familiar words to almost everybody in our audience tonight. Okay, quote, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal stations to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Unquote. Okay, so the pastor was paying heavy evidence. I'm sorry, let me restart that. He was putting heavy emphasis on the phrase nature's God and Creator. And people in the congregation were kind of oohing and eyeing. And there was a lady in front of me who was almost going into a mental swoon because, it sounded like, well, these guys were, the guy who wrote this was an evangelical, And I heard about 6 more things about America's founding fathers who weren't true. And I actually walked out, and that was the first time I'd ever walked out on a sermon, I just walked out. I said, I know it was written by Thomas Paine. This is not correct. So I'm going to give you what I later sent to that pastor, what Thomas Paine really meant by nature's God and my Creator, okay? This is the actual context, okay? Here's what Thomas Paine wrote, quote, when I see throughout the greatest parts of this book, meaning the Bible, scarcely anything but a history of the grossest vices and a collection of the most paltry and contemptible tales, I cannot dishonor my Creator by calling it by his name, unquote. That's what he meant by his Creator. He was not talking about the Bible, okay? Something he believed in. And as far as nature's God goes, let me give you Thomas Paine's context for nature's God. Quote, when we look through nature up to nature's God, we are in the right road of happiness. But when we trust the books, meaning the Bible, as the Word of God and confide in them as revealed religion, we're afloat on the ocean of uncertainty and shatter into contending factions, unquote. Thomas Paine. So by nature's God and Creator in the Declaration of Independence, he was not talking about the Bible's God. He was talking about what he talked about in the Age of Reason, his own mind, or the God of nature. You couldn't really come out and say you were an atheist in that day like you could in Darwin's day. You couldn't call yourself an agnostic as Thomas Huxley did. It was still an article of faith that there was a creator, but he went as far towards agnosticism as he possibly could, and those are his actual contexts, and he was not talking about creator in a Christian sense at all.
Now, you also mentioned in the article the various grievances you mentioned and how, say, they were probably exaggerated for political purposes.
Yes. I'll tell you one of the things that one of the things that got me into this was the Battle of Lexington. What got me into that was when I took my son on a tour of Lexington, and I heard the tour guide saying things that didn't make much sense, and I started to investigate, found it was a false flag. What got me into the American Revolution and started asking questions about it was my own Christian faith, because revolution, as I expect you know, Timothy, is not really consistent with biblical values. The Bible tells us that in general, we should be respectful to authority, okay? We know that Satan staged the revolution, and we certainly don't like it when we have rebellious children. So rebellion, as a general concept, is not something that's really consistent with Christianity. And I had this question, and then you look at the chief grievance was taxation, right? That was, we'll get into this actually tonight. The Molasses Act, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Act, and the Tea Act. Okay, those were the British. That was the main grievance, was the taxes. And yet, when Jesus was cornered by the Pharisees in an attempt to entrap him, and they said, should we pay our taxes to Caesar? He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's, right? And that didn't mean Jesus was a tax advocate, but he did say you should pay your taxes. And I've heard many pastors preach on paying taxes, and on, when April the 15th is approaching, they will look around the congregation. I've heard 2 pastors do this and say, I hope you're all paying your taxes honestly and not taking deductions you don't deserve, you know. Um, and because Jesus said we should render to Caesar what's Caesar's. Yet, if you ask those very same pastors, should we should the founding fathers have paid taxes? They say no, and they'll defend the founding fathers' revolution and the Boston Tea Party, and you know, not, and so I asked a pastor once who was defending the founding fathers, and I said, well, it seems like paying taxes is not unbiblical. So why did the founding fathers not have to pay taxes? And he said it's because they had other grievances. So I started looking at what those other grievances were, and it turns out that they are the grievances listed by Thomas Paine in the Declaration of Independence. And so in my online article, I do investigate what those are, and I did find them wanting. So why don't we take a look at those grievances? I mean, we can't go over all 27, Tim, but I want to touch on some of them.
Certainly.
If you look at the Declaration of Independence, the very first one is the king has refused, he, meaning the king, has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. Okay, so if you were accused of breaking the law, I imagine you'd probably want to know, okay, what law did I break? And you'll notice that the Declaration doesn't specify what law the king refused his assent to, because there weren't any laws he refused his assent to. And in fact, the only significant laws overridden by Parliament during King George III's reign were the ones pertaining to the Americans printing their own money, which was probably a bad idea by Parliament, but it wasn't King George III in any event. All right, continuing. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from their depository of public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Unquote. That's from the Declaration of Independence. Now, if you ask most people what that meant, they would have no idea. And here's what it actually meant. In 1768, which is 8 years earlier, the British had sent troops to Boston because it had become really a bedlam of violence under Sam Adams' dictatorship, and that's something I talk about in my first article on the American Revolution on my website. They were restoring order, and Sam Adams and the Massachusetts House of Representatives, which met in Boston, demanded that they not hold proceedings with the British troops so close. And so the royal governor said, that's fine, you can meet across the river in Cambridge. You know, Cambridge is right across the river from Boston. And they met at Harvard University, where they'd actually often met before. They met there during a outbreak of smallpox, for example. And by the way, Harvard was very comfortable, but that's where they met for a few months, and that's all that's talking about. And that was 1768. By 1776, it was all forgotten about. Nobody remembered it except probably Sam Adams, who probably had to tell Thomas Paine about it. Thomas Paine wasn't around when that happened. He wouldn't have known about it. Somebody had to clue him in, and that presumably was Sam Adams, the father of the American Revolution, as he was called in his day. Okay. By the way, I doubt that King George even knew that this happened in Boston in 1768. But continue with the grievances in the Declaration of Independence. It says, speaking of the king, quote, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, unquote. Okay, Tim, all that means is that there had been a long-standing rule in America that when a foreigner came here, he couldn't become a citizen right away. He had to live here for 8 years before he could become naturalized. And that is very similar to the laws we have in America today. You have to live in America for 5 years before you can apply for citizenship. This had nothing to do with King George. It was no way favorable or unfavorable to the king. It's just something that it's Thomas Paine grasping at straws, trying to find some complaint to make about the king. Okay, another one. You'll read in the Declaration. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries, unquote. All right. Actually, some of the judges in America were paid by the crown, but that was a long-standing practice that preceded King George, and it had long been considered a favor by the colonies that they didn't have to pay the salary of these judges, and the decisions they made as judges were in no way based on subservience to King George III. They just made decisions independent of him. But here, let me quote one which is what I consider the favorite. This is the one that people understand. And so you often hear people quote this from the Declaration of Independence. Quote, he has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out of their substance, unquote. Okay, a multitude of new offices. How many offices were actually created under King George III in America? Only one, not multitudes. And that was the Customs Office. And I'm going to talk about why that was created. It was created um, because of something that Ben Franklin told the Parliament. Okay, it's actually his idea. But they created the Customs Office, and how many people worked for it? You know, any government office like the post office has to have a few employees. Well, the Customs Office had 4 governors, and underneath them there were about, I don't think anybody knows the exact number. There were about 40 officers and clerks, so about 45 employees for 13 colonies. That's about maybe 4 max per colony. I wouldn't call that swarms. All right. Okay. And here's one that kind of gets me. Okay, it says, quote, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures, unquote. Okay, let me just point out that the colonial legislatures had militias which were under their authority, but the Army of Great Britain was under the authority of Parliament and the King, and that was appropriate, that was constitutional. They were not under the authority of our legislatures in the colonies. Just as today, our army is under the authority of the president and the Congress. It's not under the authority of Puerto Rico, for example. Okay, you don't have to get Puerto Rico's permission to put troops there. It's under the authority of the president and the Congress. And the British Army was under the authority of the King and the Parliament. That was appropriate. Nothing wrong with it. Okay, the very next clause in the Declaration of Independence says he has effected to render the military independent and superior to the civil power, unquote. Okay, that is based on the fallacy in the preceding clause, which says that somehow the British Army is under the authority of the colonial legislatures, which it's not. So this is just a fallacious argument, and let me just say it does not speak well for Thomas Paine that he was being just so dishonest in writing this. Next, I'm omitting some of them, but I'm trying to be concise because we can't go over them all. Quote, for transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses, unquote. Okay, so this implies that the King George III transported colonists and tried them in England. In point of fact, not a single colonist was ever brought to England for trial. Okay, they had the authority to do it, but they never enforced that authority. Okay, so, you know, it's not a grievance. All right. Do you want to say something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of those grievances and comparing to what we face today. It's whether it's taxation with representation or the swarms of bureaucrats and regulations which strangle the American economy and harass everybody, whether it's the IRS or EPA or the Bureau of Land Management or the Park Authority. I mean,
right.
So
yeah.
I mean, it's
pretty mild in comparison to what today. In fact, let's get into that. The reason that Thomas Paine had to erect this long list of grievances was because by the real grievance was taxation. There's no question about that. But by 1773, and this will come as a shock to some of our listeners, because I was always told that we'd been reduced to tax slavery by Great Britain. But the truth is, by 1773, which is 2 years before the Revolution began, there were no British taxes on America whatsoever, with the sole exception of a customs duty on tea of 3 pennies on a pound of tea. That was it. And that led to the Boston Tea Party. That was it. That was the only tax that Britain was laying on America by 1773. And it says in the Declaration of Independence, quote, governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, unquote. Well, obviously, a 3-cent tax on a pound of tea is a pretty light and transient cause. That's why Thomas Paine had to erect this other list of grievances, okay, to try to make it sound like there was some reason for this revolution. I would say that a 3-cent tax on tea is not a cause for blood in the streets. But let's go back for a moment over the real cause of the conflict, at least the cause that had engendered all this dissonance between America and England, which was a taxation. Let's talk a little about the tax policy. Can we do that, Tim?
Sure.
Um, Again, I was always told as a child that America was reduced to slavery by British taxes. Let's ask a question. Why did Britain start to tax the colonies? The reason was this. They had just finished fighting the French and Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763, a 9-year war. And by the end of that war, their national debt had doubled. And British taxpayers didn't feel that the entire burden of paying off that debt should be borne by them. They felt that since American colonists were the chief beneficiaries of the French and Indian War, that the Americans should contribute something to paying off the debt. And actually, I think that's pretty reasonable.
And
So,
didn't wasn't also sparked by young George Washington going beyond his orders at Fort Necessity, and I guess it was it Fort Duquesne, the French fort in the Ohio Valley that Washington sparked the war with.
I have to go and read up on that because it's French and Indian Wars. Uh, Strategic elements are not in my mind
Yeah,
at all. But that's probably a great point to add to all of this. But in any event, the reason they started to place a tax on America was because of the cost of that war. And so in 1763, they imposed one tax. It was called the Sugar Act, and it placed a tax of 3 pennies on a gallon of molasses. And this was vigorously protested by Sam Adams' Sons of Liberty, and so it was repealed. And the British tried what they called the Stamp Act, which had been a very successful maneuver tax measure in Britain. And what that did, it placed a tax on documents such as business contracts and diplomas and newspapers. And that was vigorously protested in the colonies, so vigorously that Britain never actually received a single penny of revenue from the colonies from it.
and that was also picking a fight with newspapermen and lawyers, right?
Right,
Yeah,
which is probably not a good idea
yeah.
since they control so much, newspapers control so much opinion, and
Hmm.
lawyers make such great diplomats and legislators. But okay, so after these two measures were repealed, the Parliament asked for Ben Franklin to come forward and speak to Parliament because he was one of the chief representatives of the colonies in Britain at the time. They said, Mr. Franklin, you didn't like the tax measures we tried, so what will Americans accept? And I've got the full exchange in my first article on the Battle of Lexington, the Secret Spirit at Lexington Green on my website. But here's what Ben Franklin um, told to the Parliament. Um, I'm sorry, I've lost
It's
my
okay.
place.
Wasn't it something to the effect that they would accept a
Okay.
customs tax?
Oh, yes. Here's what he said. Okay.
Yeah.
Here, Franklin to Parliament, exact quote. I have never heard of an objection to the right of laying duties to regulate commerce. I know that whenever the subject has occurred in conversation where I've been present, it has appeared to be the opinion of everyone that we cannot be taxed by Parliament wherein we are not represented. But the payment of duties by an act of Parliament as regulations of commerce was never disputed, unquote, Benjamin Franklin speaking to Parliament. So the Parliament said, okay, you, the Americans, say that we have the right to tax our own commerce through customs duties. So that's what we'll do. And that's what resulted in what was called the Townshend Acts of 1767. And they placed duties on various British goods that were sold in America because Benjamin Franklin said that Americans would not protest that. And so that's where the customs office, the one office they created, was came about. But that was vigorously protested by Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty. So they repealed that, and they left only one tax, one customs duty, and that was on tea. And that's the whole story of British taxation in America. Now, if you ask a David Bartonized pastor if he would have taken part in the Boston Tea Party, he'll say, of course, I would have been out there. I would have been throwing those chests of tea overboard. I wouldn't have paid those taxes to Great Britain. Yet those same pastors have no problem with all the taxes we pay today, federal income tax, state income tax, social security tax, Medicare tax, real estate tax, sales tax, excise tax, utilities tax. You were talking about this, Timothy. All the taxes we pay today. I mean, what we're paying in the colonial times was nothing compared to what we pay today. And I shouldn't say all pastors say this is nothing. I know that I'm sure there are many pastors who who find our taxes quite disagreeable. But the thing is that they do tell their congregations that you should render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, but they think that the colonists, for some reason, had an exemption from this, and this is what I call free pass theology. It's my own term, but they give a free pass to the founding fathers to things that they don't give exceptions to their own congregations for today, and that kind of ticks me off. But that's how they've been schooled, and that's what they think, and they think that that there's no problem for blood to run in the streets over a 3-penny tax on a pound of tea, but there's no reason why we should rebel today against the taxes we pay today. I don't know what the comparison is, Tim, but I would guess we probably pay easily 100 times more in taxes than what we paid to King George through that little customs duty of 3 pennies on a pound of tea.
Yeah, good point. And also, when you talk about taxation, no taxation without representation. Obviously, they did have some sort of, I think, de facto representation, because whenever Parliament passed a tax that the people didn't like and people protested it, Parliament acted rather pragmatically and repealed it, correct?
Yes, and actually you're bringing up a great point. The claim made by the colonies and by Ben Franklin himself was that they couldn't be taxed because they didn't have representation. They did have representation in the sense that they had people like Ben Franklin to lobby the Parliament, and they had their own legislatures in the colonies which could lobby the royal governor over taxes, but they didn't have voting representatives. That's what it all boiled down to. But here's the thing, Tim, that as far as having voting representatives in the Parliament goes, for one thing, being a representative in Parliament was not a paid position, so I don't know that the colonies would have found anyone who really wanted to volunteer and go over there and sit in Parliament. Remember, this was about a 2-month voyage back then. There were no steamships; they were just sailing vessels. And here's the thing that really occurs to me is why this was so impractical, the idea of taxation with representation. Okay, suppose you have a voting representative from a colony from the colonies in Parliament. Parliament makes a tax proposal for the colonies. Well, if you want to sound out your constituents, you would have to sail back to the colonies or send a letter back to the colonies or a messenger back to the colonies. That's a 2-month voyage. Then you've got to reconvene your local assemblies, take a vote, and now you've got to go back to England again. That's another 2 months about to come back. And all the representatives are coming back at different times, probably. So you're talking about a very inefficient way to run the Parliament. And the last point I would make about this is that we were not, the population of America was not nearly that of Britain at the time. So we would have been outvoted anyway. So we would have lost on these tax measures, even if we did have a representation in the Parliament. So the truth is that the whole idea of taxation without representation was more of an excuse for a revolution. The fact of the matter is that there were Freemasons who wanted to get this war going no matter what. No matter how lenient the taxes became, they still called for blood. No matter how lenient Britain was, they still called for blood. And there was a governor of Massachusetts named Thomas Hutchison. I almost wanted to call my article A Tale of Three Thomases, because you have Thomas Paine, Thomas Hutchison, and Thomas Jefferson all involved in this. But Thomas Hutchison wrote about the grievances, and he pointed out that I'm looking for the quote. Okay, he said this quote. This is Thomas Hutchison, Massachusetts born, by the way, former governor of Massachusetts. He said, quote, "There were men in each of the principal colonies who had independence in view before any of those taxes were laid or proposed. A concession has only produced a further demand, and I verily believe if everything had been granted short of absolute independence, they would not have been contented, for this was the object from the beginning," unquote. Unquote, Thomas Hutchison. I do believe that's true. The point I want to make here is that it was not the grievances that led to this revolution. The grievances were contrived. I'm not against liberty. I am not advocating that we become a colony of Britain again. Not by no means am I advocating that be unpractical. I am for liberty. But the fact of the matter is this revolution, like so many wars we've fought today, was based on pretexts that were not genuine.
Yes, and another point is that we get into this voting fetish as if voting
Hmm.
is all that matters. You vote, and what voting does is if you consent to voting, you add legitimacy to the system, what the system does to you, because you had your vote. Now you have
Hmm.
to accept. Now you have to accept what the majority or what the public decided.
Hmm.
Whereas if you weren't voting, whereas we had a system in the colonies where the Parliament could pass a tax and people didn't vote, it was much easier to mobilize people to oppose the tax because you couldn't appeal to, the outcome of the election, or an election or a vote, which tends to give legitimacy to, to whoever wins the election. So
That's right. As a matter of
yeah,
fact, Sam Adams, who was called the father of the revolution, he became after the war, he headed up the Massachusetts legislature. And you might have heard of a Shays Rebellion.
yes,
It was after the war, veterans of the war found their property was confiscated by the state of Massachusetts for failure to pay taxes, right? So some of the colonists rebelled, and Sam Adams called for them to be executed, and two of them were hung. And Sam Adams said, "Well, we have a representative government. You can't rebel against that." So your point is quite correct that tyranny became acceptable as long as you had what was called a representative government in the
yes.
eyes of someone like Sam Adams.
So the tyrant moved 3,000 miles closer.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah,
Now, by the way, I know
that's
we're probably
it's very Masonic, don't you think? It's a Masonic
well,
trick.
we're offending a lot of people, I know, but I want to mention something else too about King George III. Um, we're taught by people like uh, David Barton that this was a Christian revolution, but I want to describe King George III, and this is from an American historian named William H. Hallahan. Here's how he describes him, quote, "He was extraordinarily hardworking, diligent, religious, frugal, and moral. To those around him, including his ministers, he was a generous, kindly man with a gentle sense of teasing humor. The young monarch had dreaded the prospect of being king, yet accepting it as a sacred trust and duty, he vowed to reign with all his might, even if it killed him. As head of the Anglican Church and deeply religious, George dutifully said his prayers from the official Anglican Bible, but with a significant change in the text. In his personal copy of the Bible, he ordered every reference to our most religious and gracious king to be deleted and overprinted with a most miserable sinner. The king believed in fresh air, exercise, and a vegetarian diet between breakfast and dinner. He allowed himself one slice of bread and a dish of black tea. He set a proper example for his family and country at all times. He was a devoted husband and father, rising at 6 a.m. to spend 2 hours every day with his wife and 15 children," unquote. Now, compare that to Thomas Paine, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, and who said Christianity is, quote, "repugnant to reason," and the Bible is, quote, "impositions and forgeries," unquote. Who do you think is the better Christian here? When you're talking about, seriously, I know we're offending people, but I want to talk about what this revolution was really
You
about.
mentioned Shays Rebellion too, right?
Hmm?
There's also the Whiskey Rebellion, right?
The Whiskey Rebellion,
And
sure.
that was a
That was
response
also
to
quashed, right?
the duties on spirits and these things. And these things were currency for a lot of people. Also, an important source of calories at the day. It wasn't just getting drunk, but it was also used as a form of currency for a lot of these people. The farmers, people who live in the rural areas. Of course, the people in the rural areas got nothing out of what was going on in Washington D.C. or the cities, and they said, "Why should we pay this tax?" Well, believe the tax was imposed to pay for the bonds that were paid on par. This was the deal that Hamilton struck. Uh, they went around and they bought off these Revolutionary War bonds on pennies, and then they got the Congress. They had advanced knowledge that Congress would pay them back, redeem them at full value with gold, and the whiskey tax was imposed to pay for that. And so the whole country was born in a bond swindle.
Yeah, Tim, you're really well informed on these things, and you remind me of something else, which is, I had mentioned the customs duty on tea of 3 pennies per pound. I should mention that the U.S. established its customs office in 1789. So from the very get-go, we had our own customs duties that we laid on goods. King George's customs duty on tea was unacceptable, but our own customs duties, no problem. We've got a representative government, so customs duties and taxes fully acceptable now. You have to put up with them.
Well, meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Maybe even a little bit worse.
Yes,
Um,
well,
so
that's the trick of revolution, isn't it?
yeah, and I know we've been going for a while, but I wanted to talk to wrap up by talking a little bit about revolution and what it means. I mentioned before that rebellion is not really consistent with the Bible. You have a darn good reason for rebellion, and um, again, we don't like rebellious children, and Satan, we know his nature is one of rebellion. So I want to talk a little bit about what Thomas Paine was really about. He's called an American patriot, but as I mentioned, he left America before the Constitution was even instituted. He went to England. He tried to incite the people to overthrow King George III there. He failed, and he went to France. And he became a French citizen. He took part in the French Revolution, became a French citizen. It was a member of the French Assembly, and he called for the overthrow of King Louis XVI, in spite of the fact that King Louis XVI had funded the American Revolution. So talk about your inconsistent loyalties. He was not an American patriot. He was a globalist anti-monarchist is what he was, and anti-Christian. And here's where I want to bring in the real meaning of the rights that he talked about. He talked a lot about rights, and I'm in favor of rights, and you're in favor of rights. But what I want to bring out is this. We've been schooled as Americans, to despise the idea of a king, But I want to talk a little about why that is. As you know, we have what are called the powers that be. And those powers that be go back to the Zionist Rothschilds, who funded Adam Weishaupt, who funded the Illuminati, who funded the Freemason revolutions that were overthrew Europe. We have that book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, published in 1798 by John Robison perhaps is the proper pronunciation, who was well respected as a professor of natural philosophy in Scotland, and but his book Proofs of a Conspiracy was the full title was Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe, carried on in secret meetings of Freemasons and Illuminati. So he was exposing this in 1798. So what were the Rothschilds after? And I want to just explain this in terms that people will understand. The Rothschilds, to overthrow the governments of Europe, and they were all overthrown. All the kings are gone now. We have the European Union in their place, okay? And religion has been overthrown exactly as Robison predicted. The great cathedrals are all empty now on Sundays, okay? There's, I think, only something like 6 or 7% of Europeans consider themselves Christian today. All right, so the revolution succeeded, funded by the Rothschilds. And here's what they knew. They knew that they could not get into the bloodline of a hereditary monarch. And that is the reason they opposed kings, because they knew that to take over the nations of Europe, they had to get rid of the monarchies. They could not get into those bloodlines. So how do you get rid of a monarch? Through revolution. And that's why you'll see Freemasons involved in the French Revolution, the 1910 Portugal Revolution, the Mazzini revolutions in Italy, and even the Young Turk Revolution that overthrew the Sultan. These were all Rothschild-funded and Freemasonic. Freemasons make very good revolutionary tools because they take oaths of absolute obedience as well as secrecy. So they wanted to get rid of the monarchs, and that is really, as well as religion, as well as Christianity, and that's why you have a guy like Thomas Paine attacking, number one, monarchs, and number two, Christianity. And so, no, I don't respect this guy as a great American patriot or someone that we owe tribute to. I believe his loyalties were to the very people who we fight against in alternative media today.
Hmm. So yeah, the Illuminati's, I guess, goal was the destruction of throne and altar, as you said.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what it was all about. Now, he did talk about rights, but I'm going to quote something that is going to be controversial, okay? But if you talk about the Rothschilds, it's almost inseparable from them. And we could do a show on this someday. But if you look in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, I've got a full chapter on those in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior. Like everybody else, I thought they were a hoax until I actually read them, okay? And then when I saw that they were talking about Darwin and giving people vaccines to poison them and stuff like that, I said, whoa, I don't think this is written by the Tsar's police as a hoax, okay? All right, but here's what it says that's relevant to our conversation tonight. Now I'm going to quote Protocol 5.3. Quote, in the times when the peoples looked on kings on their thrones as a pure manifestation of the will of God, they submitted without a murmur to the despotic power of kings. But from the day we insinuated into their minds the conception of their own rights, they began to regard the occupants of thrones as ordinary mortals. The holy unction of the Lord's anointed has fallen from the heads of kings in the eyes of the people, and when we also robbed them of their faith in God, the might of power was flung upon the streets, unquote, Protocol 5.3. I'm going to quote one more. This Protocol 126, quote, in all corners of the earth, the words liberty, equality, fraternity brought to our ranks through our blind agents, whole legions who bore our banners with enthusiasm. And all the time these words were cankerworms at work, boring into the well-being of the Goyim, putting an end everywhere to peace, quiet solidarity, and destroying all the foundations of the Goya states. As you will later see, this helped us to our triumph. It gave us the possibility, among other things, of getting into our hands the MasterCard, the destruction of the very existence of the aristocracy of the Goyim, that class which was the only defense peoples and countries had against us, unquote. So I brought a lot of controversy here, but I do believe we've tied it together here. We are looking at a Rothschild-funded, Illuminati-driven master plan of revolution for Freemasonic Illuminati purposes, and Thomas Paine and the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the contrived grievances therein was very much a part of this.
Now, of course, the Rothschilds' ascendancy, at least they came to power in the early 19th century when I think Baron de Rothschild shorted the markets on news of Napoleon's victory at Waterloo, right?
That's why they made an absolute killing in 1815 by
Yeah.
they knew through their carrier pigeon system that Wellington had been victorious at
Yeah.
Waterloo, but they spread a false rumor on the London Stock Exchange that the battle had been a disastrous defeat, which caused the market to collapse. They then went in and bought up stocks for pennies on the pound, and then of course the news came that in fact Napoleon had been defeated, and the stocks rebounded. They made a killing, but they were already controlling the Freemasons and Adam Weishaupt back in the 18th century before this had happened. So they were in it the revolutions from the get go.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was when the British acquired the Suez Canal. It was the Rothschilds who loaned Disraeli, who was the prime minister.
Mm.
He couldn't get Parliament to meet on the decision, so he borrowed the money directly from the Rothschilds. People think that Disraeli was a Rothschild agent. He was the big Englander versus the Gladstone, who was a little Englander. But I think it was in the PBS special Queen Victoria. There's a scene in it where Disraeli asks for a loan from Rothschild. And Rothschild says, "What collateral do you offer?" And his response is, "The British state."
And I can believe that. And Timothy, you are very well informed. I'm sure one reason being that you have terrific guests. By the way, I realize that what we've said tonight is probably offensive to people, and so I want to give people a reference, more than one reference to go to. My belief, Timothy, is very much in alignment. And if I get to write a part 3 on the American Revolution, it's going to be on this. I believe that America was actually founded for these very Freemasonic purposes. And we think of America as a Christian, founded by Christians, which is true. But when America was discovered, which I believe was preceded Columbus, when America was discovered, Francis Bacon referred to it as the new Atlantis. And of course, Francis Bacon is considered by many to be the founder of both Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. This is before the first Grand Masonic Lodge was founded in Britain in 1717. We're now talking about Shakespeare's era. Okay, so he called America the New Atlantis. You know, Atlantis had been the satanic state that in the Bible God had wiped out with a great flood. Now, in the underworld, the secret societies of Europe that operated in contempt of Christianity. When they realized that America had been discovered, they decided they were going to, in this new land, occupy it and begin the New World Order there, their Novus Ordo Seclorum. And so they would use Christians hardworking Christians, of course, to clear out the land. And they would also use nations, Spain, France, and England, to their power and their money to civilize and build up this nation, and then they would kick them out. And so you'll see in the French and Indian War, the French got kicked out, and the moment that war ended, the Freemasons immediately switched gears and began kicking the British out. This was the plan from the beginning. And as a reference on this, okay, I want to recommend a book called The Secret Founding of America by Nicholas Hagar. But above anything, I want to, for people who have heard enough talking now, recommend a series of films by Chris Pinto. It's a four-part, I believe it's 4 parts. It's called The Secret Founding of America, where he goes into all of this from A to Z, from Francis Bacon, from the pre-discovery of America before Christopher Columbus, the Freemasonic purposes behind it, Sir Walter Raleigh, the Virginia colony, right through the Revolution, Sam Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, all of that. It's in his 4-part series which is called The Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings. Now, you can buy this on Amazon, but at the risk of costing Chris a few royalties, it's also, I see it's available. All of these movies, I believe, are available right now on YouTube, which he probably doesn't mind because I know he's committed to the truth on this. The one I would recommend people begin with, this is the one that first really tipped me off to Thomas Paine and the non-Christian character of many of the Founding Fathers. And we're not trying to generalize about them, but we're trying to shed some light on truth here. The film I would recommend people begin with is called Secret Mysteries, The Secret Hidden Faith of the Founding Fathers, excuse me. Hidden Faith of the Founding Fathers is the first film in this series that I would recommend people watch. It's a real mind opener. So I do recommend, if people are looking for affirmation of what we've been saying today, again, my apologies to people because I was schooled in this same type of thinking, Tim. I grew up reading books like America's Godly Heritage, and reading about George Washington's prayer at Valley Forge, and we're not trying to deny the Christian elements within the founding of America, but these elements of secret societies and Freemasonry and revolution for truly Luciferian purposes has been completely wiped out of the history books, and people do need to wake up to it. So giving full respect to people who believe otherwise, I just encourage people to watch these films by Chris Pinto, read my articles, The American Revolution Part 1, The Secrets Buried at Lexington Green, all about what really took place in Lexington on April the 19th, 1775, and also my article, The American Revolution Part 2, Who Wrote the Declaration of Independence, which goes over these points we made tonight. And all of these are documented, and you can check those resources yourself.
Yes, and a couple points. You mentioned the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and that's those are they've been debunked as forgeries supposedly.
Mm-hmm.
I believe one of the people who debunked it was Alan Welsh Dulles.
Right. Yeah.
So,
this is supposedly the guy, Mr. X, who brought this document to Philip Graves of the London Times. These were published in English in 1920 and caused a shock throughout the world because it's a satanic plan for a New World Order, overthrowing governments, using Freemasonry, communism. Like I say, even vaccines are mentioned in there, and that just stunned me.
In 1920.
Yes, and they translated from the Russian, which was published in 1903 by Serge Nelius. So, but within 1 year of their publication in English, you had this article in the London Times published by Philip Graves, who said he'd gotten documents from a mysterious Mr. X we never identified, and people do suspect that was Alan Dulles. Mr. X was Alan Dulles, who later became director of the CIA. But I do in my book, Truth of the Lonely Warrior. I do have a chapter on the protocols. I talk about they have passages in there about how they're going to control presidents and override the constitutions of nations through executive orders. And this is back in the early 1900s in Russia. Why are they talking about this when they're under a czar? Why are they talking about presidents? So when I read this with fascination, and I saw that everything in there, even distracting people with sports, is in there.
Yeah.
You believe it? Okay, so you really think this is a forgery? Read them, and again, people have debunked the forgery argument quite thoroughly. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. I don't think you'll come much closer to a prototype of what their plan is. And that's why these have been so bitterly denounced as forgeries, because they don't want people to read it. In fact, you know what? In the Soviet Union, it was the death penalty if you had owned a copy of the protocols. So that's how bitterly they were attempting to suppress this document from public knowledge.
Yeah. And another thing, if you're wondering, if you're looking around the state of affairs today, the United States being this force of so much instability throughout the world, well, go back to the origins of the United States, this Freemasonic origins, and the goal was always to spread revolution throughout the world, and by that you have to do it through instability. The British pursued a similar policy, the British Whig policy, through the lodges, beginning around the early 1720s, I guess, is use these lodges as meeting places and also sort of a technology to destabilization on the continent to achieve their imperial objectives. And it's not just crackpot, tin hat theory here. There's a book called Builders of Empire, where Freemasonry was a big part in the establishment and expansion of the British Empire.
Right,
Yeah.
and as a matter of fact, and I was talking before about everybody on Paul Revere's ride was a member of St. Andrew's Lodge. By members of the ride, I'm talking about the people who were involved with that ride from the beginning to the end. The man who ordered it and the man who received the message at the end. Those guys all met at the Green Dragon Tavern, and I consider a very appropriate name for the lodge to be meeting at, the Green Dragon Tavern. But yes, this was very much a Freemasonic game plan. And let me just point out, just to bring further connectivity, we see these unjustified wars everywhere we fight a war. Tim, we're told it's for the defense of our liberties, right? And, George Bush famously said that the people who did 9/11 were attacking our freedoms, right? It's always for the purpose of freedom. And that is also what the American Revolution is allegedly about, for the defense of our liberties, right? So it's the exact same pretext being given in 1776 is being given for these unjustifiable wars that are destabilizing the Middle East now, creating the refugee crisis, and creating the chaos out of which a third world war could come. So there's a lot of consistency here that we're talking about.
It's always the language of liberty, whether it's women's liberty, women's lib,
Right.
sexual liberation is the big one. Talk about instability, stoking the flames of instability there, but undermining society. But again, what we're talking about here is it is Freemasonry again is a technology to enable those people to engage in high level criminality and malfeasance. I mean,
Yes.
it's not just crazy stuff, because we look at the so-called mafia. That's organized on Freemasonic principles. Look at the intelligence agencies. The compartmentalization, that's rings within rings,
Right.
and the plausible deniability, and the idea of by way of deception we wage war. These things are all Masonic principles. So all the intelligence agencies throughout the world operate under these principles. And this is how you engage again in destabilization, criminality, malfeasance, and get it done and without getting caught.
Yeah, you don't get caught because it's a state secret, just as the Masonic lodges are sworn to secrecy as to what occurs within the confines of their lodges. So, Tim, one thing I'm learning tonight is that you have a wealth of knowledge at your fingertips, and I'm sure this comes both from your personal research as well as the variety of informed guests that you've had on a regular basis on Our Interesting Times.
Oh, thank you.
Or is it These Interesting Times? I'm sorry.
Our interesting times, yeah.
Okay, all right.
Oh yeah, just I stand on the shoulders of many people, so yeah. I try to aggregate the information. I'm not, none of us direct my own research. I try to
Right.
and aggregate it and put it out there. So
Exactly. That's what we all do. what we do is we depend on the researchers who've gone before us or are contemporary to us who contribute to the overall picture. And that's what you and I are trying to do, while the mass media and Operation Mockingbird are trying to paint this house of cards false image of what the world is about through the false consensus of the mainstream media, which is owned by 6 corporations here in America. We're trying to paint a house of truth and peel off all those layers of lies that they have done up through their paid spokespersons. So we're here unpaid and motivated only by a desire to serve God and serve our fellow man by bringing the truth to their attention.
Well, they say the truths are such a free. It's not going to make you,
Yes.
but it does not going to make you rich. So
Yeah, yeah. Not too many of us get rich off the truth. That's true.
no.
But they say that there's treasures for the God's people in heaven.
Yes, yes. Well, James, I want to thank you for spending so much time with me tonight. It's a fascinating article. Again, the whole idea of the United States, the American Revolution, the true meaning, the motivations behind the revolution, what the United States represents today. Um, to look into this stuff is to acknowledge some ugly truths
Mhm.
about our country and about the past, 400 or 500 years of history in Western civilization, and that's the role of secret societies, primarily Freemasonry, and that's a whole other area that people should look into because it's the area that never gets talked about. When you
Mhm.
read,
Yeah.
you don't hear about it in civics textbooks. You don't read about it in
No,
history.
not in history class. No, not
Although
even at the college level. No.
there was an anti-Masonic party in the United States, right? I mean, there was a political.
Oh, yeah, that was a good time when the 1820s, around 1830, there was an anti-Masonic party, and that is a party in that's my definition of a party.
Well, at the same time, people believe in the mafia, and they believed in the international communist conspiracy.
Hmm.
They believe in so they what's so hard to believe about an international globalist corporatist conspiracy? That's Luciferian in its philosophy.
Right, and I think that one of the reasons people were clued in on communist danger and the mafia was that people were catching on, so they said, "Okay, let's pull our attention away a little bit from this. We'll just say it's the communist, and when we make the Untouchables, we're only going to talk about Italian mobs. We're not going to mention Meyer Lansky
That's
and
right.
the,
Yeah,
the Purple Gang and the Jewish mob. So they would divert our attention onto some partial truths, but not the full truth.
or the art of the limited hangout. So there you
Yeah,
go. So,
yeah.
well,
Limited hangout, perfect.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Well, okay. Listen, James. We'll talk again soon.
yeah. This has been a great show.
Yeah.
We've touched on some great matter, and again, I realize we may have shaken people up a little bit, but again, I'm hoping we can draw people to the truth. Because that is where God is with. My loyalty to the truth will always be greater than loyalty to patriotism, especially if that patriotism is in some way based on falsehood.
And it doesn't mean you can't love America,
Right.
love your
Yes.
community, still
Yes.
go to your church,
Hmm.
make your church better by
Hmm.
pointing out the truth.
Hmm.
Can't love your family, your extended family, nor does it mean you can't like baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. So
Or mom. Yeah.
or mom. So so great. Okay, listen. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk again soon. And good night. Thanks
Okay.
a
Good
lot.
night, Tim. Thanks. Great. Great show.